Hey guys, we're going to be starting off at chapter 5, House with a Clock in its Walls. Where we left off yesterday, Lewis was saying, okay guys, I think it's time for bed. We should all go to bed. Halloween night. And so they went back to Jonathan's house, but Lewis did not go back to bed. So, chapter 5. As the luminous hands of his new Westclock's bedside clock crept around toward midnight, Lewis lay, fully dressed, under his covers. The room was dark. His heart was pounding, and he kept saying over and over to himself, I wish I didn't have to do it. I wish I didn't have to do it. He felt his pants pocket for the piece of paper with the magic circle copied on it. There was a fat piece of yellow chalk in his other pocket. What if Uncle Jonathan came to his room to see if he were all right? He'd just have to pull the covers up to his chin and pretend that he was asleep. Tick, 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 tick. Lewis wished that it was next week and he had never made his stupid promise to Tarby. He closed his eyes and stared at the patterns that formed inside of his eyelids. Minutes passed. Suddenly, Lewis sat up. He threw back the covers and stared at the clock. It was 5 minutes after 12. He had promised to meet Tarby in the cemetery at midnight, and now he was going to be late. What could he do? Tarby wouldn't wait for him. He would go home, and tomorrow he would tell all his friends how Lewis had chickened out. Lewis rubbed his face and tried to think. The cemetery stood atop a long ridge that rose just on the other side of Wilder Creek Park. You had to walk half a mile beyond the city limits to get to the road that ran up the ridge. There was a shortcut, of course, but Lewis hadn't intended to take it. Now he had no choice. Lewis rubbed his face and tried to think. The cemetery stood atop a long ridge that rose just on the other side of Wilder Creek Park. You had to walk half a mile beyond the city limits to get to the road that ran up the ridge. There was a shortcut, of course, but Lewis hadn't intended to take it. Now he had no choice. Slowly, carefully, Lewis eased himself down onto the floor. He knelt down and groped under the bed for his flashlight. It was long, old-fashioned flashlight with a fluted handle and a big round lamp at the end. The metal felt cold and slimy in his hand. He went to the closet and put on his heavy jacket. It would be cold up on Cemetery Hill. Lewis opened the bedroom door. The hall was dark as usual, and from the next room he could hear Uncle Jonathan snoring. Lewis felt awful. It was like being sick to your stomach. He wished with all his heart that he could run into Jonathan's room, wake him up, and tell him about the adventure he was going on and why he had to go through it. But he didn't do any of those things. Instead, he tiptoed across the hall and opened the door that led to the back stairs. It didn't take long for Lewis to get to the other side of town. When he reached the city limits sign, he poked around the side of the road until he found a little wooden staircase that ran down the gravel bank to Wilder Creek Park. The creek that was fairly shallow at this point, so Lewis waded across. The water was freezing on his ankles. When he got to the other side, he looked up. His hands felt sweaty. He almost turned around and went home. He was looking at Cemetery Hill. It was high, flat-topped ridge, cut across in two places by narrow dirt road. It wasn't a hard hill to climb. New Zebedee children went up and down it every day during the summer. But to Lewis, who was scared of heights, it might as well have been Mount Everest. Lewis looked up at the dark hill, and he swallowed a couple times. Maybe if he took a long way around. Nope, he was already late, and Tarby might get bored and go home. The last thing Lewis wanted to be in the cemetery alone at this time of night. He got a tight grip on his flashlight and started to climb. At the first landing, Lewis stopped. He was breathing hard, and the front of his jacket was soaked through. There were black smudges on the knees of his trousers, and there was a big twig in his shoe. 2 more stages. Lewis gritted his teeth and went on. At the top of the hill, he dropped to his knees and crossed himself several times. The sweat was running down his face, and he could feel his heart thumping. Well, he had done it. It was no great triumph, because Tarby had probably scaled the ridge in 1/10 of the time it had taken him, but at least he had done it. Lewis looked around. He was standing at the edge of the long avenue lined with willow trees. The bare strings of the willows swayed in the wind, and Lewis shivered. He felt very cold and very alone. At the far end of the avenue, the great gate of the cemetery glimmered. Lewis started to walk toward it. The cemetery gate was a heavy arch of stone covered with elaborate carving. On the lintel was inscribed these words, "The trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised." Lewis pushed open the squeaky iron gate and walked quickly past the rows of the white headstones. The mausoleum was on the other side of the cemetery hill, the side that looked out across the deep valley beyond the town. A little narrow path led down to the stone platform in front of the tomb door. Where was Tarby? As Lewis looked around, someone said, "Boo!" Lewis almost fainted. It was Tarby, of course, hiding in the shadow of the stone arch on the front of the mausoleum. "Hi, you sure look long enough, or you sure took long enough," said Tarby. "Where were you?" "It was hard work climbing," said Lewis, staring sadly down at his wet and dirty trousers. "It's always hard climbing for fatzos," said Tarby. What you lose some weight?" "Come on, let's do what we're supposed to be doing," said Lewis. He felt depressed. The cracked and mossy stone slab that lay on the door step of the tomb was in the shadow of the hillside now. Everything around it lay in the bright moonlight. Lewis turned on the flashlight and played the pale beam over the ugly iron doors. A heavy chain held the doors together. It was fastened by a large heart-shaped padlock. Lewis flashed the beam up. There was a strange-looking O on the cornice. The wind had died down. Everything was quiet. Lewis handed the flashlight to Tarby and knelt down. Out came the scrap of paper and the chalk. He drew a big circle and then a smaller one within it, like this. Shows the little... As Tarby held the flashlight steady, Lewis filled the border of the magic circle with symbols from a piece of paper. When he had chalked in the last strange sign, there was still a blank space in the border. Lewis had read in Jonathan's book that you were supposed to fill in the space with the name of the dead person, but he didn't know the name. "Well," said Tarby, "I don't see any dead people. It's not finished," said Lewis. "We've got to put in the name." Tarby looked disgusted. "You mean you don't know it?" "No, I don't," sighed Lewis. "Maybe if we sit here for a minute or two, it'll come to us." They knelt silently at the door of the tomb. A sudden gust of wind rattled the dead leaves on an oak tree that grew nearby. Minutes passed. Lewis's mind was completely blank. Then, for some reason, he picked up the chalk. "Hold the flashlight down here," he said. Slowly, carefully, he spelled out a name. The funny thing was, he was not thinking of a name at all. It was as if someone else was guiding his hand. With one last downstroke of the chalk, he completed the word. Selena. It was a strange name. Lewis had never known anyone called Selena. He didn't even know how to pronounce the name, but there it was. He stood up with the creased paper in his hand, and now he started to chant in a high-pitched, nervous voice. "Abe, bebe, bacha, be." He stopped. Tarby, who was crouched beside him, grabbed his arm and squeezed it hard. From deep within the tomb came a sound. Boom! A deep, hollow sound. The iron doors jolted as if they had been struck a blow from inside. The chain rattled and there was a clink on the pavement. The padlock had fallen off, and now, as the boys knelt terrified, two small spots of freezing gray light appeared. They hovered and danced before the doors of the tomb, which now stood ajar, and something blacker than the night, blacker than ink spilled into water, was oozing from the space between the doors. Tarby shook Lewis and squeezed his arm harder. "Run!" he shouted. They tumbled over the bank and started to scramble down the hillside. Part of the way, Lewis slid on his belly, with roots scratching at his face. He clawed at the wet, slippery grass, but he couldn't get a handhold. And then he was tumbling over and over, and he was sliding on his back. Rocks scraped his shoulder blades and bumped the back of his head. And then he was sitting on the dirt road, thoroughly shaken, sick and scared. The moon drifted out from behind a thin veil of clouds and stared down at Lewis as if it were scared too. Tarby was sprawled near him in a weedy ditch. He got up quick and stared back at the hillside. Now he was tugging at Lewis's arm. "Come on, we've got to get out of here. It might come after us." "Oh, come on, please come on." Here's the picture. Lewis was dazed and shaken, but he got up and followed Tarby over the next stage of the hillside, and then the next one. And were soon on the gravel road that led back to New Zebedee. As they walked along, Lewis kept stamping and shuddering. Tarby told them to be quiet. "I can't help it," said Lewis in a sick voice. "Did you see it? It was awful." "I don't know what I saw," said Tarby slowly. "Maybe it was the moonlight or something." Lewis stared at him. Was Tarby kidding, or was he trying to deny it to himself that he had seen what he really had seen? Lewis didn't know and didn't care. All he knew was that he was terribly frightened. Lewis sneaked back into the house a little before 3 a.m. He tiptoed back up the stairs, checked to make sure that his uncle was asleep. He was, and he quietly opened the door of his own room, just as quietly as he shut it behind him. Then he slowly began to strip off his wet and dirty clothes, which he wadded up and threw it to a dark corner of his closet. Where was his flashlight? Darby must have taken it. He would get it back from him later. As for the clothes, he could get them cleaned without Jonathan knowing about it. Lewis went to bed. He tried to sleep, but all he could see with his when his eyes closed were those two eyes, burning circles of light. Finally, he did drift off, but he had a strange dream. Clock hands and skeleton bones were chasing him around and around the high stone tomb. Lewis awoke with a start, and for a moment it seemed as that his room and this whole house was filled with a loud ticking noise. Chapter 6. The next morning, when Lewis came down for breakfast, Uncle Jonathan was reading an article on the front page of the New Zebedee Chronicles. Curious Lewis leaned over to his shoulder, and this is what it read: Tomb desecrated by vandals. Answer sought to senseless act. Last night, vandals broke into the old Izard mausoleum in Oak Ridge Cemetery. The doors of the tomb were found standing ajar, with a padlock lying shattered on the pavement. The incident has sadly marred what was otherwise a Halloween remarkably free from incidents of vandalism and wanton destructiveness. What these human ghouls hoped to attain lies mercifully beyond conjecture, but it may be hoped. Morning, Lewis, said Jonathan without looking up. Did you sleep well? Lewis turned pale. Did Jonathan know? Mrs. Zimmerman was sitting across the table munching her Cheerios. Did it say whether they disturbed the coffins? She asked. No, it doesn't, said Jonathan. The caretaker probably just shoved the doors shut and fastened them with a new padlock. I don't blame him. I wouldn't want to look inside old Isaac Izard's tomb. Lewis sat down. There were too many things whirling around in his head, and he was trying to get them straightened out. I was up in the cemetery with Darby a couple of times, Uncle Jonathan, he said cautiously, but I didn't see any tomb with Izard on it. Oh, well, he didn't want his name on the tomb. When he had it fixed up for his wife's body, he brought in a stonecutter who chiseled off the family name and carved on Omega. An Omega? Said Lewis. What's that? It's the last letter of the Greek alphabet. It's supposed to be used a lot by wizards. It looks like an O, except that it's open at the bottom. It's the sign of the Last Judgment, the end of the world. Lewis sat there, staring at the little O's floating in his bowl. He forced himself to eat a few of them. How come he wanted something like that on his tomb? Asked Lewis. He was trying to conceal the tremble in his voice. Lord knows, Lewis, said Jonathan. Say, you're not scared about this tomb-breaking business, are you? Old Isaac Izard's dead and gone. He's not going to bother us anymore. Lewis looked at Jonathan, and then he looked at Mrs. Zimmerman. He knew, as well as he knew anything, that he couldn't wait for him to go off to school so they could discuss the matter alone. So he finished up his breakfast, mumbled goodbye to both of them, and grabbed his books and left. Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman did indeed want to discuss the break-in alone. Any tampering with a tomb of two powerful wizards, like Isaac and Selina Izard, was a matter for serious discussion, and they didn't want to frighten Lewis with their talk, but they had no idea what Lewis had done. Jonathan was not in the habit of peering at the sleeping form of his nephew during the night, so he had no idea that Lewis had been out of the house. Of course, he and Mrs. Zimmerman had been concerned for some time about Lewis's strange behavior, but they did not connect it with what had happened on Halloween night. I am actually going to stop there because we still have a decent amount left of the chapter. We'll pick up tomorrow where we left off. It's getting good. Make sure you leave a comment or an interesting fact or just anything about what we have read today. So I look forward to seeing your comments because it's getting good. See you guys tomorrow.